He burned the crime scene to ash, thinking he'd erased every trace. 34 years later, a ghost just got caught. On today's episode of Verified Crime Files, we dive into the truth behind real cases, hidden motives, and the stories that shook lives. Stay with us for the facts, and when you're done watching, subscribe, tap the bell, and share. The night of December 6, 1991, began with the mundane rhythm of a Friday in Austin, Texas. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of cedar and the distant hum of the city's burgeoning music scene. At the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane, 4 young girls were finishing their shifts or stopping by to visit. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas were the employees on duty, while Jennifer's younger sister Sarah and their friend Amy Ayers had come to hitch a ride home. The shop was a bright, neon-lit sanctuary of teenage innocence, a place of frozen treats and easy laughter. But as the clock neared midnight, the lights didn't just dim, they vanished into a thick, acrid haze. Passers-by noticed smoke billowing from the storefront, a sight that initially suggested a kitchen accident or an electrical fire. When the Austin Fire Department arrived and breached the doors, they were met with a heat that felt unnatural, a searing wall of flame that hid a much darker reality within the storage area of the small shop. As the smoke cleared and the embers were extinguished, the grim discovery sent a shockwave through the heart of Texas that would resonate for decades. The firefighters found the bodies of the 4 girls, bound with their own clothing and executed with a precision that chilled the seasoned investigators who soon swarmed the scene. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, it was a calculated act of cruelty designed to be erased by the very fire they had just fought. The crime scene was a chaotic tableau of melted plastic and charred remains, making the recovery of fingerprints or biological evidence nearly impossible in those early hours. The community, once feeling the safety of a mid-sized capital city, suddenly felt the predatory gaze of an unknown monster. The girls were Austin's daughters, and their loss became a collective trauma, a wound that refused to heal as the days turned into weeks without a single viable lead. The smoke had cleared, but the darkness had only just begun to settle over the city. In the months following the massacre, the Austin Police Department faced an unprecedented level of public and political pressure. Every tip was chased down, every local troublemaker interrogated, and the FBI's profiling units were brought in to decode the mind of someone who could kill children and then light a match. Yet, despite the thousands of man-hours, the trail remained stubbornly cold. The physical evidence was scant. The intense heat of the fire had degraded the DNA technology of the 1990s, and the ballistic evidence, small-caliber shell casings, pointed to a weapon that was common and easily discarded. Investigators looked into everything from local gangs to traveling drifters, but the yogurt shop killer seemed to have vanished into the Texas humidity. The families of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah were left in a purgatory of grief, their lives bifurcated into before and after the fire, as the case files grew into a mountain of paper that offered more questions than answers. By the mid-90s, the case had become a symbol of investigative frustration. The lack of a breakthrough led to a sense of helplessness within the department, as seasoned detectives retired with the faces of the 4 girls etched into their memories. There were moments of false hope, brief flurries of activity, when a new lead emerged from a prison snitch or a psychic's tip, but they all withered under scrutiny. The killers, if there were more than one, had displayed a terrifying level of forensic awareness for the time, using the fire as a chemical broom to sweep the shop clean. As Austin grew, transforming from a sleepy college town into a tech hub, the yogurt shop was demolished, and a new building took its place, but the ghost of the crime remained. The vanishing trail wasn't just a failure of police work, it was a testament to the sheer anonymity of the predator who had walked among them, a man who understood that if he didn't leave a name, he could remain a legend of terror. In the late autumn of 1998, Lexington, Kentucky, was a city defined by its stately horse farms and the quiet, industrious rhythm of the bluegrass region. On a cold November morning, 43-year-old Linda Marie Rutledge arrived at the Nixon Hearing Aid Center, a place dedicated to restoring the senses of the elderly and the hard of hearing. It was a mundane setting, the kind of sterile, professional environment where violence felt like a distant, impossible concept. Linda was a woman known for her kindness and her dedication to her work, a stable presence in a community that prided itself on safety. However, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the silence of the clinic was shattered by the sharp, metallic crack of a firearm. The assailant did not just take Linda's life, he sought to incinerate the very evidence of his presence. Much like the scene in Austin 7 years prior, the killer used fire as a secondary weapon, igniting the facility in a desperate bid to turn biological traces into ash and smoke. The fire department arrived to find a scene that was eerily familiar to those who had studied the Texas massacre: a lone woman, an execution-style shooting, and a deliberate attempt to let the flames speak the final word. The investigation into Linda Rutledge's death immediately hit the same wall that had frustrated Austin detectives for years. The fire had been effective, damaging the structural integrity of the clinic and contaminating the forensic landscape with soot and water. Despite the best efforts of Lexington's finest, the motive remained obscured. It wasn't a robbery in the traditional sense, as nothing of significant value seemed to have been the primary target. Rather, it felt like an act of opportunistic predation. The lead detectives combed through Linda's life, searching for a disgruntled client or a shadow from her past, but they found only a woman who was loved and respected. What they didn't know, what no one could have known in the pre-digital age of siloed police databases, was that the small-caliber shell casing recovered from the debris was a mechanical twin to the one sitting in an evidence locker 1,500 miles away in Texas. The shadow that had fallen over Lexington was not a local one. It was a traveling darkness that moved with the anonymity of the interstate highway system, leaving behind families broken by a violence they could never truly understand. By 1999, the man responsible for this trail of blood was finally cornered, though not for the crimes that would eventually define his legacy. In the small town of Kennett, Missouri, Robert Eugene Brashers found himself at the end of a very long and very dark road. Brashers was a man who lived on the periphery of society, a transient figure with a history of minor arrests that masked a much more sinister appetite. When police attempted to confront him regarding a stolen vehicle and a separate shooting incident, the situation rapidly escalated into a high-stakes standoff. The air in Kennett was thick with the tension of sirens and the distorted commands of megaphones as officers surrounded the motel where Brashers had hunkered down. He was a man who knew the walls were closing in, and more importantly, he knew what the modern world of forensic science was beginning to do to men like him. Rather than face the judgment of a courtroom or the possibility of a needle in his arm, Brashers chose a final, violent exit. A single gunshot rang out from inside the room, and when the tactical teams finally breached the door, they found a man who had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving behind a cold body and a litany of unanswered questions. At the time of his death, Robert Brashers was just another violent transient whose life had ended in a sordid motel room. There was no immediate realization that the man on the floor was the architect of the yogurt shop murders or the killer of Linda Rutledge. The Missouri authorities processed the scene as a suicide following a criminal confrontation, and Brashers was eventually buried, his name fading into the administrative files of the state. Because DNA databases were still in their infancy and ballistic imaging was not yet integrated into a national network, the connections remained invisible. Brashers had successfully escaped justice by exiting the world before his biological signature could be matched to the carnage he left behind in Texas and Kentucky. For over 25 years, he remained a ghost, a nameless monster who had terrorized the 1990s and then vanished, leaving the families of his victims to wonder if their loved ones' killer was still walking among them. Perhaps even sitting next to them in a crowded diner or passing them on a dark highway. While Brashers lay in a Missouri grave, the city of Austin was desperate for closure, a desperation that led to one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in Texas history. In 1999, the same year Brashers died, Austin police arrested 4 young men, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Morris Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, based largely on coerced confessions and circumstantial pressure. The Austin Four became the faces of the crime, their names dragged through the media as the city breathed a collective, albeit premature, sigh of relief. The narrative presented by prosecutors was one of teenage angst and random, senseless cruelty, a story that fit the public's need for a tangible villain. Springsteen and Scott were eventually convicted, with Springsteen even receiving a death sentence. The trials were high-drama affairs, filled with emotional testimony from the victims' families, who believed they were finally seeing the men responsible for the 1991 fire held to account. The legal system seemed to have worked, closing a painful chapter with the finality of a gavel, but the foundation of the case was built on the shifting sands of false memories and high-pressure interrogation tactics. The illusion of justice began to crumble in the mid-2000s as DNA technology advanced beyond the capabilities of the initial investigation. When the defense teams pushed for new testing on the biological evidence recovered from the yogurt shop, specifically a YSTR profile from a male donor found on one of the victims, the results were explosive. The DNA did not match any of the 4 men who had been arrested. It pointed to an unknown male P, a ghost whose genetic signature was present at the scene but whose identity remained a total mystery. By 2009, the charges against Springsteen and Scott were dismissed, and they were released from prison, leaving the families of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah in a state of renewed agony. The case was colder than ever, and the realization that the true killer had been free, or was perhaps dead, while 4 innocent men were jailed, cast a long, dark shadow over the Austin Police Department. The search for male P became the new obsession for a generation of detectives who realized that the answer wasn't in a confession room, but in the microscopic strands of a double helix. The turning point came not from a traditional lead, but from the quiet, relentless march of the genomic revolution. As the 2010s gave way to the 2020s, forensic genealogy, the same technology used to catch the Golden State Killer, began to be applied to the yogurt shop evidence. This process involved taking the degraded DNA samples from the 1991 scene and uploading them to public databases, searching for distant cousins and family trees that could narrow down the identity of unknown male P. It was a painstaking, slow-burn process that required detectives to act as both scientists and historians, tracing lineages back through decades of births, marriages, and deaths. In Austin, a dedicated cold case unit refused to let the file gather dust, working in the background as the public's attention drifted. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of millions, hoping that a random relative of the killer had once taken a home DNA test for curiosity's sake. The goal was to find a surname, a location, or a face that could finally be placed next to the horror of that December night. By late 2024 and early 2025, the genealogical map began to coalesce around a single name, Robert Eugene Brashers. When investigators cross-referenced this name with his criminal history and his 1999 suicide in Missouri, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with terrifying precision. Brashers had been in the right places at the right times, and his physical description matched the few hazy eyewitness accounts from the early 90s, but the DNA was only half of the story. To truly close the case, they needed more than just a genetic match. They needed to link him to the specific mechanics of the crimes. This led Austin detectives to reach out to other jurisdictions, looking for signature crimes involving small-caliber handguns and arson. The digital walls that had once separated police departments were now falling, and as the Austin team uploaded their findings into the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, NIBIN, they triggered a silent alarm in Lexington, Kentucky, that had been waiting 34 years to go off. In the quiet, hum-filled rooms of the Austin Police Department's Digital Forensics Wing, a breakthrough occurred in July 2025 that would rewrite the history of 2 states. For decades, ballistics, the study of the unique fingerprints left by a gun on a shell casing, was limited by the physical distance between evidence lockers. A detective in Texas had no way of knowing that a .22 caliber casing found in a Kentucky fire matched the one in his own drawer. However, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, NIBIN, had finally reached a level of sophistication where high-resolution 3D imaging could be cross-referenced across the country in seconds. When Austin detectives uploaded the digital signature of the casing from the "I can't believe it's yogurt" shop, the system didn't return a no match as it had 1,000 times before. Instead, it flagged a hit from a cold case file in Lexington, Kentucky, the 1998 murder of Linda Marie Rutledge. The atmosphere in the department shifted instantly from routine investigation to high-stakes revelation. This wasn't just a lead, it was a mechanical certainty. The same firing pin had struck the primers of both casings. The same rifling had etched its unique, microscopic map onto the lead. The connection bridged a 7-year gap in the killer's timeline and 1,500 miles of American highway. Austin detectives immediately contacted their counterparts in Lexington, sharing the profile of their prime suspect, Robert Eugene Brashers. The Lexington team, who had long ago exhausted every local lead in the Rutledge case, suddenly had a name and a face to attach to the shadow that had haunted the Nixon Hearing Aid Center. The signature of the killer, a small-caliber execution followed by a forensic fire, was no longer a theory. It was a proven pattern of a serial predator who had moved across the South with a terrifying, undetected fluidity. While the digital match in NIBIN provided the direction, the final, undeniable proof required the meticulous labor of the Kentucky State Police Forensics Lab. Forensic science is a discipline of patience, and the technicians in Kentucky knew that the weight of 2 decades of grief rested on their microscopes. They requested the physical evidence from Austin to be transported under heavy guard, allowing for a side-by-side comparison that would stand up in any court of law, even one where the defendant was already dead. Under the intense glare of comparison microscopes, the breech face marks and ejector patterns were scrutinized. Every scratch and gouge on the brass told the same story. The weapon used to execute 4 teenagers in 1990, one was the exact same weapon used to kill Linda Rutledge in 1998. The mechanical evidence was absolute, but the team took it a step further, utilizing modern DNA extraction techniques on the old Lexington evidence to see if Brashers had left a biological calling card there as well. The results were a dual victory for modern science. The DNA recovered from the Kentucky scene matched the profile extracted from Brashers, remains in Missouri, and the male P profile from the Austin yogurt shop. This was the holy grail of cold case forensics, a perfect trifecta of ballistics, DNA, and geographic profiling. The lab's confirmation turned a series of disconnected tragedies into a singular narrative of a serial killer's career. It provided the forensic glue that held the entire case together, proving that Brashers wasn't just a suspect, but the definitive architect of the carnage. As the final reports were signed and digitized, the technical phase of the investigation came to a close. The how and the who had been answered. All that remained was the formal announcement to a public that had long ago given up hope of ever knowing the truth. With the forensic link established, a darker task began, reconstructing the life of Robert Eugene Brashers to understand how he had remained invisible for so long. He was a man of unremarkable appearance, often described by those who crossed his path as a drifter or a handyman, the kind of person who occupies the background of a photograph without ever drawing the eye. He moved through South Carolina, Missouri, Texas, and Kentucky, often living in motels or short-term rentals, taking odd jobs that allowed him to observe his surroundings without establishing deep roots. Psychologically, Brashers was a predator of opportunity who refined his methods over time. The 1991 Austin murders were likely a testing ground, a moment where he realized that fire could mask the lack of a personal connection to his victims. He was not a celebrity killer who sought the limelight. He was a shark, moving constantly to stay alive, driven by an internal dark compulsion that he kept hidden behind a mask of mundane normalcy. The profile that emerged was one of a man who exploited the gaps in the American legal and social systems of the 1990s. He traveled the interstate corridors, preying on those in vulnerable or isolated positions, late-night shop workers or lone office employees. His choice of a .22 caliber weapon was telling. It was a quiet, utilitarian tool of a killer who prioritized efficiency and concealment over shock value. By the time he reached his final standoff in Missouri in 1999, Brashers had potentially committed at least 8 murders across 4 states. He was a pioneer of the forensic fire technique, a method that successfully stymied investigators for over 30 years. The tragedy of Brashers' life was not just the lives he took, but the fact that he was able to die on his own terms, taking the full extent of his crimes to the grave and leaving behind a wake of destroyed families and wrongly accused men. On a Wednesday in 2025, the Lexington Police Department held a press conference that felt more like a memorial service than a police briefing. The room was packed with journalists, but the front rows were reserved for the families of Linda Rutledge and the representatives from Austin. When the chief of police stood at the podium and declared that the case was officially solved, a heavy, palpable silence fell over the room. They laid out the timeline, the July 2025 ballistic match, the DNA verification, and the definitive identification of Robert Eugene Brashers. For the Rutledge family, it was a moment of bittersweet validation. They finally had a name to place in the void where their mother and sister had been. The announcement was not a celebration, as the news release stated. It does not bring Linda back. However, it offered the one thing the legal system had denied them for 28 years, the truth. The closure resonated far beyond the borders of Kentucky. In Austin, the news was met with a mixture of relief and renewed mourning. The identification of Brashers served as the final exoneration of the four men wrongly accused decades earlier, and it provided a definitive end to the yogurt shop murders investigation. The city of Austin finally knew the name of the man who had stolen four of its daughters. The official closing of the files was a procedural act, but the emotional impact was monumental. The case was moved from cold to closed by exceptional means, a bureaucratic term that signaled the suspect was dead and could not be prosecuted, but his guilt was no longer in question. The ghost had been captured by the digital age, and the weight of the unsolved mystery began to lift, replaced by the somber reality of a life of crime, finally fully documented. The story of the golden hour at Bondi, transposed here to the long road of the yogurt shop and Lexington cases, is ultimately a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the relentless march of science. The 34-year journey from the smoke of West Anderson Lane to the labs of 2025 is a reminder that while justice can be delayed, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The legacy of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Linda is not found in the violence of their deaths, but in the way their memories forced a revolution in forensic methodology. Because of them, ballistic databases are now national, and DNA technology has reached into the past to pull names from the ether. They became the catalyst for a more precise, more honest version of American justice, one that eventually admitted its mistakes and corrected its course. As the sun sets on this long-running saga, the scars remain, but they have finally begun to fade. The families of the victims have found a quiet corner of peace, knowing that the man responsible did not get away with it in the eyes of history. Robert Eugene Brashers died a coward's death in a Missouri motel, thinking he had erased his tracks, but he underestimated the persistence of the men and women who wear the badge. The story of these cases is a slow-burn narrative of heroism, not the kind found in action movies, but the kind found in a lab technician's meticulous gaze and a detective's refusal to close a file. In the end, the light of the golden hour finally reached the darkest corners of the 1990s, and the shadows were finally, permanently, cast out. Justice waited 3 decades for the technology to catch a ghost. Robert Brashers took his secrets to the grave, but the evidence followed him there. If you believe no secret stays buried forever, hit follow. This is Tales and Shadows.